is that also in his wisdom, he dispersed all of these various goods. In New England, we mined iron ore. So we had the capability of producing steel, as well as all the agricultural goods that then were through the rest of the colonies. And I said, look, this is why we needed unity as a nation, because we could stand against any other nation because of the diversity of all that we have between industry and agriculture. We could then bring that together as the unity of the states and be able to withstand almost anything.
And build a self-sufficient economy.
Correct.
Now, does that include the southern states that have this kind of triangle going on with the slaves and the rum and the...
That was something that England introduced into the colonies.
So that kind of undermined that self-sufficiency.
Correct. And that's why we had, especially the forefathers were very much against it. There were many that just because of their attitude towards economy and how the southern states then determined what they couldn't get the numbers of people to come into the southern states as you could in the northern states. Part of it was climate, part of it was how hard it was in the coastal plains and the type of living and what it would take to produce in the area. So the difference being also, you have to understand, is that New England was established for religious freedom. So our covenants, our charters with the king were so much different than what the southern states were. The southern states, as you look at in Virginia in particular with Sir Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh, his was granted and he never came to America at all. So how he would utilize and produce off of his land was by an order that was written based on his position in the court. As so were the Carolinas that were given because they were coming for economy purposes, thinking that there was gold. Georgia in particular, as you know, they thought they found a lot of gold in Georgia. When in reality, it was sparse at best. So then it was how do they then, from that investment that the king was making into his kingsmen, how can he reap from that land? And so the few that came were very saying, I can't produce and we can't get people to come and join us because of the hardships. So then to produce off the land, because England was key in the slave trade. They, between Spain and England in particular, were just high into that slave trade. So then they brought the slaves in to work the land in the southern states. Yeah.
So it was all part of these royal colonies having to produce for their...
Correct. Yes.
Their, what do you call them? Their proprietors?
May I sit down?
Yeah. So they were they royal colonies, the southern ones?
Yes.
Which
The
is kind of
southern
like
colonies.
in the pocket of the king kind of
Correct.
thing?
Yes, very much so. Whereas the northern colonies, you see, it was established under religious freedom. As you know, that the Puritans and what were called the Pilgrims, some had to leave England, as you may know, and they had to go. And so when they were able to take and look at how to get to the New World, they came back through England, and they left through England. And in doing so, those that were able to, and this was the big difference between the northern colonies and the southern colonies, was the idea that the people that came, the Puritans, via the Pilgrims, they put their own money into it. See, and so their charter with the king was to grant them self-governance, because they said, we will put our own money, we will put our own blood and our sweat into taking and establishing this land. We will call it under the name of England and give portions back to the king, but we will have that ability to self-govern.
Okay.
And that's the difference. And those charters, all the way through to my time, were viewed as a covenant with the king. A covenant with the king. So when we said that Parliament was acting without our accord, we had no representation in Parliament, was because we had no relationship with Parliament. See, our covenant wasn't with that
Parliament.
governance.
That's
No,
right.
No. Our covenant and our governance was with the king. And that's why all our appeals during that whole time of troubles were with the king. Yes.
Right.
And this goes back, many years. My father, if I may, do you know much about me? I understand that,
A little bit, not much.
yeah. What do you know? What is it?
Were you born in this country?
Yes. Yes, I was.
Where were you?
1722 in Boston.
In Boston.
Yes.
Tell us about your parents
Oh, wonderful.
and how they educated you
Yes, yes. Be delighted.
and how you related to this other Adams guy,
Yes,
your
yes.
cousin,
My cousin. Yes, my much younger cousin.
your much younger cousin.
Yes, yes, much younger. So, my parents, my grandfather, let me start with that. They came over in the 1600s and settled in the Massachusetts colony. And my father was born to a family, and at that time there were large families. He was, my grandfather and father were very prominent in the community. My father was dealing with merchants, and so he was part of that merchant trade. Also, during the French and Indian War, my father was a captain in the military, so he participated in that and was known for his military strategy capabilities. So he had great strategy. He wasn't always on the front line, but he, from the strategic capability and ensuring that the troops also, from the idea of them hitting all of their materials. So from that perspective, he was responsible for some of that. So he was always looked to in the community from his abilities that he had that way. But also, he was a deacon in the church. So and you have to excuse me from time to time because being 300 years old, I have to remember things. But at Old South was the name of the predominant church. And he attended Old South and became a deacon there. And then he saw that there was a need for the congregation to split and to grow, because it was growing. And so he talked to the leadership in Old South, and they then went out and built New South. So both were South Boston area churches, and he helped form that and became prominent within that congregation as well. He was also very prominent in the politics. He became a selectman, which would be, I guess, in your day, a council person, someone that represented the people. And so he represented the people to the council of Massachusetts and participated in that governance. He was also, because our house was on the wharf, and right there was a nice property that my father was able to build because of his businesses and his dealings. He was also did have a malt house, and so that was one of the things that I understand in your century, that the Samuel Adams Brewery is very prominent.
I've heard that.
Yes, yes.
The same guy, your dad.
It started with my father, yes.
Wow.
Yes. But I do understand that when my father left me that business, that your product that comes out of the Samuel Adams Brewery now is so much better than when I had the business.
Really?
So one of the other things that is predominant in America that my father helped start was that to take and try and raise up the virtuous and wise men that would represent the citizenry. He worked down on the wharfs and with the other prominent citizens, and they developed what they called a Caulkers Club. And the Caulkers Club was called by the British government, and by then, and we can backtrack because all of a sudden, let me step you back a little bit in history, that when Massachusetts was barely 5 years old and only 5,000 souls, we were ready to go to war with England.
Really?
Yes.
1635, or what was it?
Yes,
Something like that?
Yes. And the reason being is that covenant, that contract that we had with the king. You see, we had our own governance that was put in place. But he was sending one of his governors.
The
king.
The king. He was violating that covenant by sending
a royal
a
governor.
royal governor. And we actually, and my grandfather and family at that time, participated in raising up 200 pounds to secure Boston Harbor and to arm it. So we were Puritans. We were there for religious freedom, self-governance, guaranteed self-governance by charter, covenant charter, and yet we were being violated.
That
We were ready
really-
to go to war.
That
We
was
were
very
ready to
early.
go to war to protect that which God had granted us. You see, we always knew our rights came from God. It was very, that was the whole idea of what we understood and why we were part of that separation from the Church of England, from the Popery, from all of that as being Protestants. We protested.
Separate.
Yes, the separatists. Yes.
Wow.
So we understood then what it meant, and we understood what Mr. Bradford has understood of what we should be as that city on the hill, what was God's governance. So that was even at that time. And there were many things that happened and transpired all through that time. So when it came to my father taking and trying to find and build righteous men to help govern the people, already the corruption and the falling away and the way that the churches were perceived and religion was perceived and ordered by the king and parliament was not something that was agreeable to the King of Kings. And we always look back to good self-governance can only be directed through true biblical understanding. So my father helped form this group called the Caulkers Club. And as I understand, in modern times, throughout now all of the states, many of them still go together at that time of political season to a caucus.
Political caucus.
A caucus. So the Caulkers Club was the first foundation for the caucus in America. Now there's a caucus is the people coming together to determine on issues and to determine on political leaders who they would choose at the local level. Where that really came from was from our Teutonic and Celtic heritage. So what was...
Sometimes I heard people say Black Caucus.
The Black Caucus is a group of the black leaders that would come together for their political determination and how they were going to come together and determine what ideas, policies, or people they would support. There's other caucuses as well. Each different political group. So anytime a group of people come together, with a common idea or mindset that
Call
can
it
be
caucus.
called a caucus.
Hmm.
And so they come together to determine how they will stand together and then present themselves as they come and stand together. Now, what this was happened was that from the very beginning, every person, and this was even during my time, every person was required. It was called the folkmold from the early Teutonic time. And the folkmold required every citizen to come to those meetings when they were called by the selectmen. They would have to participate. And the reason was everybody's input, everybody's vote counted. No matter if they were the lowest, poorest person or the village idiot, their voice was important and would be heard. It was important that everyone had a voice. Everyone had a vote. So when they would come together, and we would come together in community, the idea of the caucus is that unlike, I understand, in your political time, your politicians come to you and say, we will do this for you. We will do this for you. We will do that for you. We will bring you this. I'm sorry. That is not the way it was. You see, when we came together and decided who these selectmen would be to represent us, we gave them letters of instruction and said, sir, this is what we the people are determining what we need for our safety, our security, and our economy. We the people, the individuals coming together, we determine what that looks like. Not some politicians, not somebody sitting in the House of Governance. No. They go to represent so that the different communities would come together on that common ground and determine, you sir, you being from another community, that how is it that we are trying to determine what is happening in your community, and are those things in society that we would join together in? Are there things of protection that you may need? Are there things that from farming you may need? Is there something that we could trade between one another to increase our mutual economies? You see? But then we had, because the king and parliament was imposing now rulers onto us, judges onto us, that was we also had the right of self-determination of our judges. And our judges were paid locally. But the king came in and parliament came in and said, no, we're going to pay your judges. So who would that allegiance start going to?
Yes. King's men.
Yes.
If you pay,
Yes.
will come and
Yes. You see? So we understood very clearly that the best government was always the local government. And that is always the most critical to understand. But what we also understood and expected was that we would have virtuous, moral, and knowledgeable leaders. So we had to raise them up. And that was part of the Caucus Club, was to determine who amongst us would be those types of leaders. You see, we understood what it would take for good governance. And we understood again, because of our foundations and how we came over, that it would have to be always from the King of Kings. And that's who we pledged our allegiance to. Did you know what one of the battle cries, especially out of Connecticut and Rhode Island, was? What was it?
No king but Jesus? Or
Yes, no king but King Jesus.
no
That
king
was
but
the battle cry.
Jesus.
Yes, no king but King Jesus. That was a battle cry. That
It was
terrible.
opposing that force from the king and his
Yes.
men.
Yes.
Continually trying to take
Yes.
over.
Now, as you may know, that whole idea of kingship and the divine right of the king was something that most assuredly that Luther and the Reformation and all of that was helping to unseat. And then as that came, there was a great argument at one point in the late 1500s, early 1600s, I believe. It was with a gentleman by the name of Algernon Sidney.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with him, sir?
Yes, I
Yes.
read some of his writings.
Yes, yes. And what was the most interesting thing about what he was communicating at that time?
I can't remember.
Well, the focus was the divine right of the king.
Oh, and he was unseating that?
Yes,
or-
there was an argument because at the time of Cromwell, I believe, is when it actually was.
Mhm.
Okay. So at that time of Cromwell, Sidney was with Cromwell from that
Mm.
understanding of the Puritans of that day to say that no, the king had no divine right. It was by God's grace that we would take and have governance. And through that then, the king was maybe an overseer, but he had no right over everything and everybody.
Right, and he wasn't above the law.
Correct. And he was not the head of the church. Christ was the head of the church.
Oh, and Sidney made that point too.
Yes. Yes. Because otherwise, how could he argue a divine right?
Right.
See? And so that was the determinations were both that you had, the kings had no right over the people, nor did he have that divine right over a body of believers.
Which king was it that really pushed that divine right of kings?
Well, there were a number of them. Charles I who lost his head over it, as well as...
Before him, did Henry the...
And Henry pushed it. Henry the
Henry the
Eighth was the very first because of his desire to have a different wife. And so it was that difference between his position against the Pope, who would not grant him a divorce,
Mm-hmm.
to that taking and saying that he would be the head over the Church of England. And separated that and made those two separate from that.
So the seeds of the divine right started kind of with him.
Yes.
And then later guys capitalized on it.
Yes. And there was always, you know, in England, that back and forth issue between the Protestant leaders and the
Mhm.
Catholic leaders, and who would rise up and who would not, depending, and that's much of the turmoil, and that's why many of the Puritans left England because of that turmoil, especially during the rise of a Catholic king or queen, and the
Mhm.
persecution of the Protestants. And granted that the Catholics were persecuted under Protestant kings or queens as well.
Mhm.
So this then goes, well, what is that right of a king or queen to persecute a different religion?
Mhm.
And where was that then under the idea of looking to God as the sole leader of the church?
Mhm.
And that was the difference that the Protestants had, and I talk about very profoundly, was popery and what that meant. You see, in America at first we were very against Catholics understanding how they could participate in the American government, because we gave our allegiance to Christ, and we knew that we needed to have self-governance.
Mm.
And we saw that at that time, and I understand that it has changed much in your time, but at that time, the Catholics' allegiance was to the Pope. So we could not understand that if their allegiance was to the Pope, how they could have allegiance to America. So a national, a national allegiance, we always said, is important. And I understand in your time that you have groups of people that trying to diffuse your national identities.
Yes.
No. Don't let that happen. Tommy! Don't let that happen. Your national identity is your national identity. Be proud of it. How can you be a patriot without having something to be a patriot to? Patriotic about. You see. The only way that you are a world citizen is in the world of Christ and in the unity of the body of His church. But when it comes to your national sovereignty, we always said, do not give up your national sovereignty. You see, because it then leads to another form of oppression. It leads to tyranny. Because you're a sovereign citizen. Your sovereignty begins what God has given you. And you're a sovereign. 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 You're sovereign because of that relationship with God. And then your nation is sovereign because of how it develops its relationship as a national unity. But you commerce with others. You find ways of working with others. You have to do that in society locally. And that was one of the things we clearly understood. And there are ways of doing that. What is commerce? Sir, what is to commerce? What does that mean to you?
What does that mean for me?
Yeah.
Commerce?
To have commerce.
Commerce.
Yes. Let me help you.
Just basic trading? Things that I have?
You have a shoe, sir.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
But you want to
Sure.
talk about the country between country.
Just in general commerce. Just to enjoy that free exchange.
Exchange.
Yes,
Yeah.
I have a shoes. You have a shirt.
Yes.
I can give you my shoes, and you give me my shirt.
Yes.
So
Just that free exchange.
yeah.
We clearly understood what that should be. But then there's those others that would say, for you to commerce with me, not only do I want to have a free exchange, but I not only want your shoes in that exchange, but I also want your shirt, you see. And it starts going beyond what has a sense of common value. See, free trade is that trade when we freely decide on a common value. And is there times that we need to set a tariff? Is there times that we need to say that, well, because of my resources going to you, what is the equal value then of what we're exchanging? And that then comes back to the whole idea of what is property. One of the things that we understood from our fathers that came in the 1600s and settled America was that value of property. As those that settled in Plymouth learned very quickly, was that they tried to build something in community. And their idea of community was that all shared about equally. But they found very, very soon that some were not willing to work because they could very easily get it when the time was on the efforts of others.
Mhm.
But then as they finally began to understand that, hello young pup, that as they finally began to understand that as they gave people property, because now you have ownership and sovereignty, you're more willing to put in value, to extract value, and then to trade and have commerce to increase the value.
Mhm.
But see, property, as we also clearly understood, was not just that ground that you had, was not just that tangible that you had. Property was in your mind.
Internal property.
Intellectual property. Your intellectual property is property.
What do you call intellectual property?
Intellectual property, what you would design, a new idea that you could take then and manufacture, that you could take and add value to something that you already had. As an example, if I may, this became trade, but this came from raw material. But someone had to come up with this idea to use this raw material for a purpose of a hat. Now this hat, when it came into formation, the edges were all down and it was wide open in its brim. But it was an idea to shape it like this, and it became fashionable. And it became something that people wanted. It was an idea that formulated this. Your books, knowledge, and how you bring that knowledge forward so that others can gain from that knowledge. It's how you take and you're able to bring that together, becomes part of that intellectual property. So it is that which is formed, that's given to you from your talents, your experiences, and the gifts that God gave you, that you can bring together and make that available to others, is intellectual property. And it can become tangible. It can become tangible. So that is something we understood. And all of that, Parliament was trying to tax us on.
Sure.
They were trying to take away from us. We can go back and forth through time if we will, and if you will allow me. So there's threads to this, and the common thread in everything that brought America to what we intended it to be was that idea of self-governance. And the idea that we would exchange our ideas, we would exchange our tangible properties, we would add value. Because every time this hat went through that process of making from its raw material, it increased in value. And every time you increase it in value, you determine then how it enters into commerce, or how you keep it for yourself and enjoy it. Yeah. It was being attacked. And when we looked at what was being attacked in our liberty, is that I said over and over that America had become the slaves already of England because of the way they were infringing on our property, our physical property, our tangible trade, our commerce, and even our intellectual property, and our religion. They were trying to impose again the Church of England. There was a young gentleman that was much younger than myself in Virginia by the name of Patrick Henry. That was one of his heart cries, was because there, at the time, states or colonies were allowed to have its own denomination or religion. And one of the things was the Church of England was imposing over all of Virginia. But then it came to the point that all the other denominations were being required to pay a tax to keep their churches open to the state church. And Patrick Henry rose up against that very strong. So you see, even that was being, our religious liberties were being infringed on across the colonies as well. And that's what, the South didn't come for that necessarily, but they understood the value of it. And so when that was happening very strongly in the South, we didn't experience it as much in the North, but when it was happening in the South, you had great men like Patrick Henry that were willing to stand up and to take a stand against that. I can go and continue that conversation, but just to entertain one of your other questions was about my cousin John. When I graduated from Harvard at the age of 18, because I went to Harvard at the age of 14. So this goes back to my mother. So to talk about my cousin John, I talked about my father, and we went down an interesting journey. But my mother, a gracious Christian woman, solid in her faith. And she brought to me that character and understanding of our Savior. And I was educated at home for a good portion of time, and then to the Latin school in Boston. So there I learned Latin and much of the other classicals of the day. And at the age of 14, I entered Harvard. And I was ready. So, and then when I graduated, my cousin John was only 5 years old. Yes. So there was that age difference between myself and John. Also, Mr. Washington, who became a dear friend of mine as well, he was but a child of only a few years old.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Thomas Jefferson was not even born.
Wow.
Yes.
So you're the senior, you were the senior age to those guys.
Yes. And the only one that there were others that were older than myself. But Dr. Franklin in particular.
Yeah.
And he and I were good friends. It was interesting that when I went to Harvard, is that what my mother wanted me to be was a minister. See, Harvard was a great school of ministry. It was a place that not only did you learn other opportunities of education, but predominantly pastors came out of there. Yeah. Yeah. But what happened was when I was there, I studied my biblical education. But through that, especially in the study of the Old Testament, I started to see about governance. And that was there. And then I started looking at the English, what we called the English Constitution, although England never had a written constitution, but I started reading the Magna Carta. And I started going through what was happening in our laws and the history. And then I started reading Montesquieu and other of the Greeks and Rome and republics. And what did that mean? Wow. I was sorry to disappoint my parents, because then I took that direction about liberty to the point that they almost called me a lawyer. Now, the interesting aspect is I went on to a master's degree, and when I graduated again with my master's, the time of people graduating from their master's degrees was grand. The governor would show up. All of the, at that time, the king was influencing, so the kingsmen that would be there as tax collectors or whatever their other position would be as harbor masters or that, they would be there. And my dissertation at that time was whether it be lawful to resist the great magistrate if the Commonwealth could not otherwise be saved.
What a thesis.
Oh! The governor turned to the kingsmen and he said, we must watch this young Samuel Adams. Because at this age he speaks treason. What will he be like later? So their eye was already on me. And my father gave me a stipend, a small amount of money that I and a couple friends started a newspaper. And this newspaper was one where our pamphlets would go into, because there was so much happening around governance at that time. I fell in love with liberty. And what did that mean? And understanding that that liberty had to be set first in Christ. Because what happened in America early and during that time of my youth was what you now call the First Great Awakening. So we had Jonathan Edwards who would come through. A Mr. Whitfield would come through. My sister Mary and Mr. Whitfield corresponded on a regular basis. We attended, I attended, she attended those different meetings and hearing those great men speak of the wisdom of God, the truths of God. So you see, to understand what built and formed those ideas and that common mindset in America as we move through that separation, you have to understand the messages that were being preached at that time as well. Because liberty was spoken of very clearly from the pulpit. Political liberty was spoken freely from the pulpit. Yes. There were some that were Tories. There were some that were loyal to the Parliament and the King, even as ministers. But those that had their roots in America and understood the history of our forefathers that shed their blood, that gave their money, that gave their all to secure what was forming in America, those ministers understood what needed to be spoken from the pulpits. So as you look at even my father-in-law, my first wife passed after about 7 years of our marriage. She was absolutely a wonderful Christian woman. And out of the children that she bore, 2 survived. I had a son and a daughter. And my daughter survived all the way through past me when I passed. It's funny how that is. But as she lived on, my son died early, and I would say of a broken heart. You see, he was a surgeon during the American Revolutionary War. And all that he saw and all broke his heart. And as America was coming together.
Against the Catholic Church.
Yes.
What the Church of England that wasn't a Catholic Church.
It would go back and forth in the leadership. There were some kings that started out as the Catholic Church until Henry VIII because of all the Catholic missionaries and that came in. But under Henry VIII, because of that point in time where he wanted to divorce his wife and take another, then it separated and it became Protestant, and they chose to become a Protestant nation under him. But it went after him, it would go back and forth between a Catholic leadership or a Protestant leadership. So at the time of America with the Anglican Church, it was under a Protestant leadership.
Protestant, I think the word Protestant come from the Reformation.
Yes.
Of the 16th century.
Yes,
Yes.
And,
yes.
And so there wasn't a Catholic church, there wasn't a Protestant church. It is my question. What?
They were, as a state church, it became a state church as the Anglican Church was a Protestant church. They started out very Calvinistic. So when you look at, if you look at some of their belief system, that's where they were, the Anglican Church was supposed to be that. But it became very man-oriented. So there was always that battle. But it would depend who was on the throne.
And the king was like a pope.
The king was like a pope.
Was.
That's right.
Because
Yes.
he's the
Yes.
highest
Head of the
authority
church.
of
That's
the
right.
church.
He
of
was the
one
head
church.
of the church.
Mhm.
Yes.
Like a pope.
Yes, exactly. And that's what we stood against, because that was what Algernon Sidney lost his head over, because he stood against that divine right. He said that no, the king or the queen could not be the head of the church because Christ is the head of the church. And to have what the king thought he could have ownership over the people, if he controlled their religion as much as their land, then he would have authority over the whole person. And that was when the Puritans said no, and they fled because they were being persecuted. And they fled then to the Netherlands, and into Germany, and into parts of France. And then, finally, to America. But that's what was being imposed again, was trying to take that, making the king that head of the church, even during my time, and saying he is the absolute head of the church, and he is that in all of his realm. No, 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 no. That's no. We did not accept that. Our forefathers did not accept that. But yet, in many places in Europe, that was still what they believed.
Now, the New South Church and the Old South Church were both Puritan churches,
Yes.
and what became?
Congregationalists.
And then, are they still there?
They are still there, I believe.
And are they structurally the same? I mean, are they pretty much what they were then as far as?
Actually, one of them shifted from I think in your history,
Mm-hmm.
went from the Congregationalist church to a Unitarian church.
Oh, okay. So what was the Puritan church became the Congregationalist church, and
Well, the Puritan was called that as a generic term.
for Protestant?
No, actually for the separatists, as mentioned earlier, who separated, and the denomination that they primarily were Congregationalist.
Okay.
That was what you would classify versus the Episcopalians versus
So they're just separatists.
the Anglican, or the Methodists that were coming about at that time too, under the Wesleys.
Right.
So it was that there was Congregationalist. And that was then because of the degree of understanding of the early church fathers and also of the early teachings of our forefathers. The Congregationalists were generally called Puritans.
Okay.
And Samuel Adams, one of my names that was given to me over time, one of my monikers was the last Puritan.
Ah.
And the reason for that was during the times that the English were really encroaching into Boston and what we were doing, they tried to bribe me.
Oh.
They tried to pay me off to be quiet. They tried to give me positions in government to be quiet and to come into like a paid judge and changed my allegiance from America and liberty. But I stood on my principles and understood my foundations, and I couldn't. How could you do that? How could you beguile and go against yourself? How could you go against what you believe, the truth of your Savior? How could you do that? You see, that was a struggle that I never had questions of. I was solid in my faith. And I understood that liberty was all part of faith. And the other thing that was part of liberty is what we were talking about is property. You see, that goes back to the days of Abraham. He was promised the land. And he was then the promise. And it was delivered to his posterity, to those that came after him. You see, property, be it intellectual property, be it physical property, and liberty cannot be separated. And faith in God covers it all. And none of that can be separated. You know that in your hearts. You see. But I expressed it.
And today you find Anglican church all over the world.
Yes.
And in the past, the king was the highest authority in Anglican church. And today,
Yes.
who has the highest authority?
Today, as I understand it in your present history, is that the Bishop of Canterbury is the head leader, but as a what do you call it? A showpiece. What is another term for it? A figurehead. Yes, thank you. As that figurehead, it is still the king or queen, as a figurehead only. But the authority and the decision-making authority is at that highest bishop within that, who has that relationship still to the royal family.
And who chooses or appoints the bishop?
I am not sure who does that any longer in your society in the present, but that bishop was always chosen by the king or the queen during
In the old
my
days.
time. Yes.
Now I'm trying to understand that the Anglican church is not a Protestant church, is not also a Catholic church. Until now.
Yeah,
Until now, yes, they are not Catholic and they are not Protestant.
but they call themselves a Protestant church because of their origination was from the separation from the Catholics, but much of the Anglican Church still holds to the rituals of the Catholic Church.
Right.
But their separation was that they no longer held to the Pope, but that it would be the King of England that would be their head. So what you mentioned earlier, instead of a Pope in Rome, they have their Pope in London.
In London.
But much of their theology is very, very close to Catholicism.
Right.
Bishop.
Yes. Now they changed some of their theology, even at that day, to what the Protestants were looking at and believing from the Reformation. They did a lot of that in the Anglican Church, so that's part of it. But much of their church calendar, much of their basic theology is similar to the, and their services are very similar to the Catholic Church.
The Lutheran Church is the same way.
Yes.
They
Yes.
just changed the title from priest to pastor, because you see
Yes.
the word pastor in the
That's-
New
yes.
Testament.
Yes.
They don't have as pretty buildings, obviously, as the Anglicans do, but it's
Yes.
same.
Yes, the Lutherans were always as part of that, and that was always the interesting debates, even with the Lutherans and Calvin
Yeah.
at that time, and much of that history and church history is very, very interesting. And
And
yes, go ahead.
I have you finished?
No, I'm never finished. You have to understand that I have the capacity to speak for 15 hours.
15 hours.
Yes, yes. But I yield the floor to you, sir.
He is not finished.
We are learning with our professor Josiah that there are so many people in America deny God and choose humanism to elevate people, men. And I asked myself, how can they today deny God and go to men and say there is no God? How do you see that? What happened?
How did they lose that?
If I may, that rips at my heart. You see, because that was not the direction that was being established at the foundation of this nation. It was not the direction. The intention was always that it would be a Christian nation, that the church, the body of Christ, the leadership, the pastors would always be the ones that gave that guidance in culture, in politics, in education. After I retired, and I will answer you in a moment because I'm going to refer to something that I wrote right after the Declaration of Independence. We knew that if we did not take and maintain our relationship with God, that the nation would become godless.
Right.
You see, we saw it happening in Europe. The philosophers that were determining that change in Europe in those 1700s, Hume, Rousseau, and several others, were already questioning that whole idea of who is God. And how did he fit into government? How did he fit into life? What was that value? That was already happening on the continent. Many of the things of entertainment to get the people to think away from their God relationship to a man relationship, and the frivolousness, the silliness of life was already happening on the continent. That during the time that Lord North, who became the Prime Minister during the period that we were moving into revolution, Lord North told Parliament, he said that if we can take and get those Americans to enjoy the fine arts, the music, the silliness that is happening on the continent, they will forget about liberty. Because if you start thinking about those things, that there are things to have fun, there are those things that we're to enjoy, but to make them the predominant part of their thinking and their society, they will forget about God.
Entertainment.
So when you ask, how did that start happening in America, if you will allow me, due to my age, and that it was something that I was asked to write after the Declaration of Independence. If I may, I was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And actually, earlier than that, I wrote a declaration called the Declaration of the Right of the Citizens.
Yes.
Okay? And in that, I spoke very clearly not only what was the right of the British citizen, but also what was our religious rights and our freedoms, and how did that, what did that mean in commerce and all of that. But my cousin, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and another gentleman that, you'll have to forgive me, I forget his name, were on the committee to write the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson drafted it. And when you look at the American Declaration of Independence, many Americans in particular only look at the first 2 to 3 paragraphs. But they don't read the charges against the king.
Right.
See, again, it goes back to our covenant was with the king. We pleaded with the king to help us overcome Parliament. But I had the opportunity, and as I was thinking through this grand privilege of speaking with you, this was a speech that I was asked to give, and I'm just going to capture pieces of it and some to answer your question. I gave this on the steps of Independence Hall on August 1st, 1776. The first parts of it, you see, I always said that heaven hath trust us with the management of things for eternity. And you see, this is part of what we had and we understood in our theology, is that we were managing all of these things for all of eternity. And man denies us, to you, part of your point, man denies us the ability to judge of the present in those situations, or to know from our feelings the experience that will make us happy. So even at that time, man was influencing how we were to understand our relationship with God, and also that which would give us our happiness. I continued much, and I said in there that this day I trust the reign of political Protestantism will commence with the Declaration of Independence. And I say, we have this day restored the sovereign to whom alone men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven, and with the propitious eye, an all-seeing eye, he holds his subjects, assuming that freedom of thought and dignity of self-direction which he bestowed on us. From the rising of the sun to its setting, may his kingdom come. So this was the values and the attitudes. And I talked about then when talents and virtues which heaven had bestowed on men give merely to make more obedient drudges, to sacrifice the follies and ambitions of a few, then are we abusing, are not the noble gifts that have been equally given to us by divine purpose and law should nearly be passed away? And what about those blessings of that providence of God that he has given to us, that we all may enjoy them equally? You see, if I can, I will have to reference to your exact question, if I may. Excuse me for a moment, because I saw this earlier, and I'm glad that this is critical to what happened. Over and over, what has happened is that among you, my countrymen, that is a father who claims authority to make your child a slave because you would nourish him in his infancy. Are you so much so that you would know not to give him what is proper? And isn't it strange that that generosity that would be returned is more valuable than anything else that could have been bestowed? You see, that what happened is that, if I may, I apologize, I appreciate that request, because this is an argument that we brought forward. It was because that at the time that we would fall, if ever, we would fall from that humility of soul and not cry out and give that praise to God, that the confusion of the devices among our enemies and the rage of the elements against them would come down and impact our counsel and our ability to fight. So the influences the outside influences that came into America, the expectation was that the church would remain pure. But what happened in the church in America shortly after 1803, in the 1830s, is that at that time, all these other influences of these ungodly men started to infiltrate into the church in America. There was, as I understand and have had the ability to talk to others through history, is that there is something that is well known in your time called Marxism. When did Karl Marx live?
1850s, 1890s.
1850s. Yes. The influences of socialism, Marxism, started infiltrating into the churches in America, as well as all over the world, in those mid-1800s. It became that men that were not men of God became counsel and counselors to church leadership by the 1880s and 1890s. As I understand your history, is that there became a federal council of churches that became the National Council of Churches that then associated with the World Council of Churches. These groups, those that were counseling those leaderships and helping form those groups, their allegiance was to Fabian socialism,
Yes.
Marxism, humanism. So what happened in America? The church did not remain pure. They looked to someone who would say, oh, you're smart in legal matters. Oh, you're smart in government matters. But they never came and said, where is your heart in relationship to the King of Kings? And so they looked at, oh, what's world peace? How do we do that? How do we do and take care of poverty? How do we manage all these different things instead of looking at what's local? What is important in your community? How do you maintain the morality, the virtue, and the safety of that community? Yes. Yes. You can only do it locally. And the influence of the church affects that culture. It affects how those laws are determined for that. And that's what the foundations of what we looked at for self-governance was the intent. You see, I was called an anti-federalist. When the Constitution came into formation, again, forgive me, if I may. When my cousin and Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Franklin were busy working on the Declaration of Independence, we clearly knew that we would have to find some way to associate together as states and come to some common ground. So I was on the committee that drafted the Articles of Confederation. So while they were working on the Declaration of Independence, I was working on the Articles of Confederation to help build that unity across those states. The Articles of Confederation, granted, some said had problems, and it did prove that when we looked at after the Revolution, well, even during the Revolution, I was on many committees. I was in charge of health care for the troops and acquiring funding, a number of different things. I spent the majority of the Revolutionary War in Philadelphia, and I only went home a few times because of illness. And what we saw that was so critical was that there were times we couldn't get sufficient funding from the various colonies, the states. We were beginning to call them states at that time. So there were issues after the Revolution about commerce, especially there were things that were Virginia and Maryland over water rights and fishing rights and a number of different things. So we sent men to convention to fix the Articles of Confederation. Well, the young gentleman by the name of Madison from Virginia brought a whole new idea of governance, and out of that came the Constitution of the United States. I had problems with it. I had problems because it was determining a centralized federal government. And greater were my problems that many people don't discuss or understand, is that those that were very strong on that federal constitution, when you read their arguments in the Federalist Papers, they believed that we would always have virtuous and moral leaders that would go to government, that would maintain the rights of the states and the individuals. But myself and the others, because of our beliefs, said, no, man is sinful. Man is inherently sinful. And we need to have additional protections for the states and for individuals. And that's why I stood for a Bill of Rights. I helped write the Massachusetts Constitution and its Bill of Rights. I contributed more than half to that. So I clearly knew that we needed to have those additional guarantees. The states to guarantee the liberties and the rights to the people, and the federal government to ensure that the states had their rights so that they can then ensure their rights to the people. So as the United States Constitution has its preamble, so does the Bill of Rights. And I would challenge you, when you have the time or interest, to look at that, because the preamble for the Constitution says, we the people. Whereas, I'll give you a hint, whereas the Bill of Rights was from a convention of the states for their purposes to clarify this Constitution and reserve to the states. So the Bill of Rights was for that. So I was an anti-federalist from the perspective of that. But more so was the idea of sinful man, and knowing that there may not be a church or ministers. And I talk about it in other places in here, that I can give you the reference to this document that you can find it yourself, that the anti-federalists would say that we would hope that we would have these other protections, where the Federalists were saying the church was going to do its job. And it was always going to ensure that there were these virtuous and moral leaders. And we said, no, something could go wrong. And it did. To your question. And it is hurtful to see what we saw in the future, what I saw in the future that I actually wrote about. That it could come to that time where the churches no longer did, that were values and morals and virtue would come undone